And welcome inside of this extended edition of What's Important Now. This deep dive into part one of our series, Is America Dying? Now, if you have not listened to part one, that may be something you want to do. It's found on all podcasting platforms. This is an extended version because our other podcast is fit into 30 minutes for FM radio. So this is an extension found only on podcasting platforms. Welcome inside. We are going to take a look at Rome and America and the parallels of a dying nation. So on our podcast, part one, we asked the question, is America dying? But I want to go a little bit deeper if I can, because there are a lot of questions out there. How, in fact, did the Roman Empire fall? Were there warning signs? Were they ignored? And then the big question, the one that matters most to all of us, is how closely is America tracking their decline today? Now, I'm going to warn you, this is not going to be easy to hear. But if we're going to understand where America is today, we need to understand where others have been before. And Rome, the greatest empire of its time, gives us the clearest warning. So the reality is that Rome began as a republic. And a lot of people have the misconception that America is a democracy. We are a republic. And just like Rome. And Rome was a small city-state that valued discipline, duty, and law. But over time, something began to change. As it became the largest empire in the entire world, it stretched from Britain to the Middle East. But what destroyed Rome? It wasn't the enemies at the gate. Rather, it was the enemies within. If you look at history, historians have really pointed to 5 key warnings that really Rome apparently ignored or didn't realize they were experiencing, much like America today. But number 1 was political corruption and division. And ladies and gentlemen, there's absolutely no question we live in a very, very divided time. The Senate in Rome was once respected, and it grew corrupt and self-serving. Leaders put personal wealth and power above the common good, and civil wars began to erupt as generals like Julius Caesar and Pompey fought for control and tore apart the republic itself. If you draw that beside a comparison of America, we see today that political polarization is at an all-time high. Republicans and Democrats treat each other as enemies rather than fellow citizens, and the examples are on the news every single day. Trust in government is near record lows, with only about 20% of Americans saying that they trust Washington to do the right thing most of the time. And in America, leaders often seem more interested in winning elections and enriching themselves than solving problems. Here's the thing. When political corruption dominates, nations lose unity and they lose direction. Rome fell into chaos, and it's argued, and I'm a believer, that America is walking that same road. The second thing is economic instability and debt. So in Rome, what we know historically is that there was crushing taxation and runaway spending that began to drain Rome's economy. And to pay for expansion and welfare programs, Rome debased its currency. So they reduced silver content in coins, which led to inflation. And then once productive society became dependent on government handouts, bread, and circuses to keep the masses content. That's what history teaches us about Rome. What about America today? The U.S. national debt is over $34 trillion and climbing. Inflation has devalued the dollar in recent years, making basics like food and gas harder to afford. I saw a statistic, and don't quote me on this, it's close, but it's probably not perfect, that someone who made $100,000 even 20 years ago would need to make almost $200,000 today to live at the same level. I can remember growing up that if a person made $100,000 a year as an annual salary, they were pretty good off. They were in a good place. So, but also in America, we have a growing dependency on government programs. And this leaves millions of people reliant on aid, while fewer Americans feel motivated to work hard. And so Rome learned this lesson too late. And the lesson was that no empire can spend itself into prosperity. America is learning the same lesson. Or are we? The third thing is military overreach. In Rome stretched its army across a vast empire from Britain to Syria. They defended massive borders, and it began to drain the treasury, and also morale began to change. Mercenaries, who were foreign soldiers, were paid to fight because they couldn't trust the empire's military. And listen, if a mercenary is paid to fight, they aren't going to be loyal. So what happens is eventually loyalty was weak. And what about America today? The U.S. maintains over 750 military bases in more than 70 countries, and we can have the debate as to whether or not that's right. Decades of war in Iraq and Afghanistan cost trillions of dollars with lasting stability, with little lasting stability achieved. And recruitment struggles show a military stretched thin while foreign adversaries only grow bolder. So empires collapse when they're more focused on global dominance than defending their own core. And that is a price that Rome paid, and America is heading in that same direction. The fourth thing is that moral decay and family breakdown. And this is something I talk a great deal about here on this program. But in Rome, early Rome prized duty, honor, and family. It was important. It was a part of their foundation. But later, they indulge in decadence and immorality and self-indulgence. Divorce and infidelity became common, and the family stability disintegrated. Entertainment glorified death and violence, and gladiator games replaced meaningful civic life. In America today, marriage rates are at historic lows. Nearly 40% of children are born outside of marriage. Families are weaker, with fathers absent in many homes, and a leading predictor of poverty and crime. Entertainment and culture glorify violence, sex, and self-indulgence while mocking virtue. When families collapse, nations collapse. Rome ignored the warning. The question is, will we? And then the fifth thing is the loss of civic virtue and faith. In Rome, civic virtue, which is the idea that citizens should sacrifice for the common good, was simply lost. Citizens demanded free food, free entertainment, and luxury, but refused any responsibility whatsoever. Rome's traditional religion lost meaning, leaving the empire spiritually bankrupt. And in America today, faith in God is declining. Less than half of young adults claim any religious affiliation. I talked about that on the part one of this podcast. A culture of entitlement has replaced a culture of responsibility, and citizens expect government to fix everything while taking no responsibility for their families and communities. Rome fell when it abandoned faith and virtue. If America abandons both, history will in fact repeat itself. It's absolutely, to me, it's a no-brainer. So when historians describe Rome's fall, they don't point to a single battle or an event. They point to these 5 warning signs that I just talked about that eroded the empire from within. And when we look at America, we can see the same signs blinking at us. So it really is something for us to think about. As I said earlier, Rome did not fall in a day. It didn't even fall in 1 year. It took centuries for the cracks to widen into what we now know as collapse, which historians typically point to somewhere around 476 AD as the end of the Roman Empire. And that's when Romulus Augustulus, which by the way was the last Western Roman emperor, was deposed. But by that time, Rome had already been hollowed out. There's not much left, right? So the truth is, the barbarians didn't destroy Rome. Rome destroyed itself from within. The outsiders just pushed over what was already rotting. And that's the lesson we need to hear today. Nations die from the inside before they're ever conquered from the outside. And I always think back to that moment where Khrushchev was at the UN, and he took his shoe and he pounded it on a table. And he said something along the lines of, and this is back in the 60s, he says something along the lines of that America will not be destroyed by a foreign enemy. America is going to be destroyed from within. And the reality is that even back in the 60s, you could begin to see that process starting, right? Prayer, Bible reading removed from public schools. And then we also see the just sort of animosity towards Christ that honestly has continued to grow. But Rome began as a republic with strong institutions. But as is always the case, it seems history has proven that power-hungry leaders begin to undermine it. We know that the senators in Rome grew corrupt. Civil wars broke out between generals, assassinations, and coups became normal. Eventually, emperors ruled by fear and bribery rather than principle. And again, I ask the question, does any of this sound familiar? Because in America today, we trust in government, or I should say our trust in government, as I mentioned, is at near record lows. 20%, think about that. 20% of Americans say they trust what Washington is doing. And so we are not only polarized, but we're gridlocked. And as I mentioned, we are divided. And think about the more recent elections. Everything just feels like a civil war. And it really is a civil war. America, I believe, and I've said this before, I've said it for years, that I believe America is actually entrenched in a new civil war. It's not being fought with weapons, or at least not guns or bombs. It's a civil war of ideas. The battle for the soul of America is a very real thing. It's happening right before our eyes. And we're involved in it whether we know it or not. And we're involved based on what we accept, what we refuse to stand up for or to stand against. We're involved. We're in the fight. And so today, leaders are often more interested in power and profit than principle. And so, again, Rome fell when politics became a circus of corruption and division. And yet, again, America, it could be argued, is following that same script, almost line for line, every T crossed and every I dotted. The economy, just a deeper dive into this, and the economy of Rome was once strong, but bad decisions were made, and it began to crumble. Heavy taxes began to crush the middle class. I even with the new, I think it was called the Big Beautiful Bill, and I'm not going to get political about this, but I just remember seeing a thing on social media or maybe on the internet that said, find out how much the Big Beautiful Bill will save you. And as I put in my income, it came up as $0, and I assure you I'm not wealthy. And so we see the continued strain on the middle class in America. And the same thing happened in Rome because the currency was debased. And, you know, America, I don't know if you remember this, some of you, but, and it's even before my time, but I have some of them. I'm a coin collector, and I don't really collect like paper money, but I do collect coins. But I do have some of those what are known as silver certificates, and they look different. So I have these silver certificates, and essentially what it says, and it is U.S. currency, it says that this is backed by silver. But the government has silver to back this dollar. And now it's called a Federal Reserve note because they literally just print paper. And that's what causes a lot of the inflation. And same thing was happening in Rome. And so, silver coins were replaced with cheaper metals. Inflation rose and then ultimately spiraled out of control in Rome. And then people became dependent on the state for free grain and also for their entertainment. And that's where the famous bread and circuses comes from. And so America is walking the same path. Again, as I mentioned, our debt is out of control, $34 trillion. I can't tell you the times I've stood in a classroom and thrown the debt clock, the U.S. debt clock on the wall to show students how quickly it rises and what each American would have to pay. There's not actually enough money in America today from individuals to pay off that debt. If we had to pay that debt off, it doesn't exist. It's crazy. And so with inflation, it eats away at the value of the dollar, and then more and more people begin to rely on government to survive. Politicians just keep spending as if there's no tomorrow, wasting money on transgendered mice. Unbelievable. Rome discovered it too late. They knew they found out they could not spend their way into a prosperous empire. And America is finding out the same thing. I talked to you about the military overreach, just to deep dive into this a little more. Rome was stretched out too far. They were involved in too many things. Now, it can be argued that the most recent administration is trying to scale some of that back. Again, that's an argument. Others would disagree maybe. But Rome had so many armies with such large borders trying to cover all this ground that it drained the money they had. And so they begin hiring, as I said, these mercenaries that are, they're not, it's not based on loyalty to a country. It's based on money, who pays the most. And so we are involved in so many places around the world. And morale is slipping in America. And then what we see is that our rivals like China and Russia are actually on the rise. And world politicians have stood back, especially those from China and Russia, and they've said, just give it time. America's going to they'll take care of it themselves. We won't have to fire a shot. So Rome didn't collapse because it lacked soldiers. It lacked focus. Where are we? Is America dying? Now, something I've talked a great deal about is the decay of morality and also the family breakdown. And I know when historians point to these 5 things, this is one of those things that we have to talk about, because early Rome, they valued what America has traditionally valued. Again, things like duty and honor and faith and family, but they became obsessed with pleasure. And so families collapsed, homes began to break up, and the pursuit of pleasure replaced the pursuit of purpose. And things like the gladiator games as it relates to entertainment, which, by the way, glorified death and corruption, that began to be their focal point. The things that really mattered were put on the back burner. And so we have to ask ourselves, are we kind of in that same place? The strength of a nation rests on the strength of its families. Rome ignored that, and Rome died. And if America ignores it, we're going to die too. What about the loss of civic virtue and faith? Rome wasn't about or just about politics and war. Early on, it was about civic duty. Early Romans would sacrifice for the common good. They had reverence for their gods. But by the end, that civic spirit was gone. Citizens demanded handouts, not responsibility. Their faith became an empty ritual. Christianity soared in Rome at one point, but they had lost their soul. I've already talked to you, especially in the radio version or the part one of this podcast, about the decline in church attendance in America. A nation can survive hardship, but it cannot survive the loss of faith and virtue. I want to say that again. A nation can survive hardship. It can endure difficult, challenging times, but it cannot survive the loss of faith and virtue. Now, by the time in Rome, somewhere around 410 AD, the Visigoths began to sack Rome. The empire was already broken, and then by 476 AD, Rome had been dead in their spirit for such a long time that it just took a little nudge. The barbarians did not kill Rome. They just knocked them over because they were already collapsing. And hear this chilling truth, ladies and gentlemen. America is showing the same cracks. Corruption, debt, overreach, morality, decay, a loss of virtue. The warning signs, ladies and gentlemen, they're all there. The question is, will we wake up before it's too late? So again, Rome is gone, but America doesn't have to be. And we are at a crossroads. We can ignore history and collapse the same way that Rome did, or we can repent, return to faith, rebuild the values that made us strong. Revival won't come from Washington. It won't come from Hollywood. It has to start in our homes and in our churches and in our communities. The fate of America isn't sealed yet, but the clock is ticking. And what we choose now will determine whether America dies in our generation or whether it finds new life. So let me leave you with this as I close out all of my programs. Fight the good fight of faith. Contend for the faith. There is a cause. It does matter, and it is important now. This is part one, a deeper dive. Part two next week, we're going to dive into hitting it hard and heavy on the family in America. The family under fire. That's next week. Can a nation survive without its foundation? We're going to hit it hard as we try to answer the question, is America dying? Have a wonderful day. God bless. Talk to you soon. Take care.